Thank you, sir. Good evening and welcome to our Bible study. We'll begin with prayer tonight. Father, thank you for this chance to be together. I pray that you would just speak through your word, make clear to us your path for us, Lord. May we learn from the experiences of Israel, reminding ourselves always that the book of Hebrews says all these things were written down as instructions for us upon whom the ends of the earth have come. So help us to learn the lessons of Israel in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 7, and we're going to take up where we left off last time, beginning in verse 15. Now, by way of reminder, the Israelites have rededicated themselves to the Lord. Remember that paganism had crept in to the nation, that they had started worshiping the false gods of the nations around them. Therefore, God had given them over to judgment by letting them be, lose, be conquered in battle by their enemies, the Philistines, the Amalekites, and so on. But then they rededicate themselves to the Lord. In the last Bible study we had, we read where Samuel had a service of dedication at Mizpah, and the people repented. And so it takes up from there at verse 15 and says, "And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went from year to year on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah." Of course, Bethel being the place where what was? What was in Bethel? Don't remember? The tabernacle, okay? So Bethel was, during that time, the place of sacrifice. There was no temple. Temple is not constructed until many years later, okay, under Solomon, David's son. So for all that time, from the time that they occupied the land of Canaan up until the time of Solomon, no temple, just a tent of meeting, what it was called, the tabernacle. So Bethel is where that was. So it says he went from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah and judged Israel in all those places. But he always returned to Ramah, for his home was there, and he judged Israel, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but they did not walk in his ways. They turned aside. I'm sorry, we are in the wrong place, aren't we? Wow, we have totally, somehow I got completely messed up. Sorry, we should be in 1 Samuel 11. That's my error. I don't even know how my Bible, I bookmark where I'm at every week, but I don't know how that didn't take. So Samuel has anointed Saul to be king. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 11, my apologies, it says, "Nahash the Amorite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you.' And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, 'On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel.' Of course, obviously, that's not going to happen. Then the elders of Jabesh said to him, 'Hold off for 7 days, that we may send messengers to all the territory of Israel. And then if there is no one to save us, we will come out to you.' So the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul, told the news in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now there was Saul coming behind the herd from the field, and Saul said, 'What troubles the people that they weep?' And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news. His anger was greatly aroused, so he took a yoke of oxen, cut them in pieces, and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel." Remember, we read this last week, that he put the fear of God in them because he told them basically that he would treat them that way if they did not turn out. So again, he's fulfilling right here, as we saw last week, but just it's helpful to stop and point out, he's fulfilling the prophecy which Samuel has already made about him, right? That the king shall forcibly take your sons and daughters to be in his service. Okay, so here he is. Basically, this is kind of the ancient Israelite version of the draft, come out and serve in the army or else. And it says, so they came out with one consent, and when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, the men of Judah 30,000. And they said to the messengers who came, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by this time the sun is hot, you shall have help. Then the messengers came and reported to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good to you. So they made an alliance with these people. So it was on the next day that Saul put the people in 3 companies. They came into the midst of the camp in the morning and killed Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, who is he who said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them out, that we may put them to death. But Saul said, no, a man shall not be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. So this is when Samuel comes and renews the covenant. That's where I apologize. That's where I thought we were when we were reading a few minutes ago. Come, let's go to Gilgal and renew the covenant, the kingdom, it says in some translations there. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord and made sacrifices and peace offerings there. Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now Samuel said, indeed, I have heeded your voice and all that you said to me and have made a king over you. Now here's the king walking before you. I am old and gray-headed. Look, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my childhood to this day. Here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I received any bribe with which to blind my eyes? And I will restore it to you. And they answered and said, you have not cheated us or oppressed us, nor have you taken anything from my hand. From any hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you and his anointed, that you have not found anything in my hand. And they answered, he is witness. Then Samuel said to the people, it is the Lord who raised up Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord which he did for you. Okay? So he then recounts how God was faithful to them all this time. But what did they do? In spite of God's faithfulness to them, they cried out and they began to follow the false gods of the nations around them. So in verse 10, he says, then they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord, served the Baals and Ashtoreths, but now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. And the Lord sent Zerubbabel, Badan, Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you dwelt in safely. And when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord God was your king. Now, therefore, here is the king you have chosen. Again, so Samuel repeats this whole warning, okay, that this is great wickedness. But as we said last week when we were talking about this, God is going to use them and bless them and use the king and bless the kingship and the kingdom, even though they have chosen wrongly in the sight of the Lord, okay? As he says down here at the very last of this, verse 23, moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. Okay? So we're it's, we're back where we left off last week, and the sense that you get from this, as I said, and it can be a little bit confusing, I think, that God did not want them to have a king, but God was willing to accommodate having a king, right? That wasn't God's first desire. It wasn't his highest desire. It wasn't his best. It wasn't his noblest. But he was willing to allow this as long as they continued to remain faithful to him. So it says, Saul had reigned for 1 year. And when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, he chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. Now, this is where we are first introduced to, in the text, a man who will come to play a central role in this story, okay? And this is Saul's son, Jonathan. Saul's son, Jonathan, is destined to become David's closest friend and ally, okay, as we'll discover later, because this story will progress to the point where Saul will even make an enemy out of his own son. But at this point in time, it says the troops were basically divided into 2 groups, one group that was with Saul and another group, a smaller group, with Jonathan. The rest of the people he sent away, every man to his tent. And Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Now all Israel heard it was said that Saul had attacked a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had become an abomination to the Philistines. And the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. Then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Bethaven. And when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves and thickets, in rocks and holes and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So they were really trying to get away. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. So they were with him, but they were fearful. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal. Now, if you'll remember, last chapter, what Samuel had said to him was, when you get there, wait. Wait for me. I will come up to you, and I will offer sacrifice, and then you will go into the land, and the Lord will be with you. And you may think in your mind, well, that's kind of a small detail. That's kind of a little thing. But apparently, in the eyes of God, not such a little thing, as you'll see. So Saul said, verse 9, it says, so when Samuel did not come to Gilgal, the people were scattered from him. Now verse 9, so Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened, as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering, that Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. Okay? So kind of picture in your mind what's happening here, okay? Saul calls for troops to go up and begin to go into battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines, hearing about this, are afraid of Saul, okay? They've seen what he did to the Amorites in the previous chapter, right? So they know what this army is capable of. So the Philistines call for everybody to come out, and they marshal quite a troop. In fact, horses, chariots, but beyond that, troops so numerous that they couldn't even be counted. That's a bunch of people, okay? And so the people that are with Saul begin to fear, okay? And they even begin to desert him, some even fleeing as far as to leave the country, to cross the Jordan River to get away, right? Others are hiding in dens and caves, hiding out. So the people are terrified. So what's happening here? Saul is sensing that he's losing his people, okay? He's losing control. All right? So rather than wait for Samuel to arrive, it says that he calls for the burnt offering and peace offerings to be made, and he offers them. Okay? Then Samuel comes and says, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought after himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, but because you've not kept what the Lord commanded. Okay? So, what's the expectation of Samuel here? Well, the expectation of Samuel is that he is the man who delivers the word of the Lord, okay? Saul has his role and his place, but Samuel has his role and his place. Samuel's role is to be the mouthpiece for God, to speak for God, to deliver the thus saith the Lord. Saul's role is to do what? To act on the thus saith the Lord, right? Not to act independently of God's command, but to hear God's command and act on it. So much for separation of church and state in ancient Israel, right? God's voice is supposed to be heeded by the king and obeyed right down to the very last detail. But Saul acts in fear rather than in faith, because Samuel's already told him, it's going to be okay. I'm going to come to you. I'll offer sacrifice. I'll pray over the people. Then you'll go out and God will deliver them into your hands. He's already told him this. That was prophecy, right? When Samuel says the Philistines are going to be delivered into your hand, that was prophetic. But Saul doesn't listen to the prophetic voice of the Lord. Instead, he listens to fear. And as a result of fear, he acts rashly. He offers sacrifice when God has not told him to offer sacrifice. So what does he tell him? Well, he tells him not, behold, you're going to lose to the Philistines and they're going to overrun you. No, right? Haven't gone that far yet, right? What does he tell him? Because of this, your kingdom, which God intended to be, to be passed on from generation to generation to generation in your family, because of this, the kingdom will be taken away from you, okay? Not saying that Saul's going to die right there on the spot, okay? He may serve out his kingship, but it will not be passed on to generation to generation. There will be no generational heritage for the house of Saul, okay? But instead, the kingdom shall be given to what? To a man after God's own heart, okay? So what is Samuel prophesying here? Samuel's prophesying that God has chosen Saul's successor, okay? He doesn't name him by name here, not yet, but he's announcing that God has already decided to pass over you because you're not wholehearted toward the Lord, okay? Now, that's, how many sermons could you possibly preach from that, right? That's some rich material there. You're not wholehearted after the Lord. You're not listening for the voice of the Lord. You're listening to your fears. You're listening to your anxieties. You're really more driven by the desire to be seen as the great leader among the people rather than waiting on the Lord, right? So therefore, because of this, God is going to give the kingdom to someone else after you. Then Samuel arose, went up to Gilgal, to Gibeath of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people present with him about 600 men. Now, that's interesting, okay, because Saul, first of all, acted rashly in offering the sacrifices, but they're still going up, preparing for battle. And it says that the very next thing Saul does is number the people. He takes what? A census, right? Now, later on in the history of Israel, David does the same thing, and God sends a plague. Why? Maybe, but it's more specific than that. Why does God send a plague? Because Nathan told him not to, okay? Again, it's disobeying the word of the Lord coming through the prophet of God. The prophet of God is speaking as God's mouthpiece. He's speaking with God's authority. So in the same way that Samuel has told Saul, wait until I come, I'll offer sacrifice, then you'll go out, and your household, your name shall be established forever. You're going to have such a great victory that you're going to remain king, and your children and your children's children will be kings, right? But instead, because of his disobedience now, that's not going to happen. Instead, God's going to raise up someone to replace you, right? The man who replaced him, sensing a pattern, gets warned many years later by the prophet of God, do not take a census. So he directly disobeys God by taking the census in the same way that Saul directly disobeys God by acting before Samuel gets there, okay? So let's go on and read further. It says, Saul, Jonathan, and his son, and the people present with them remained in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. Then raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned on the road to Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Another company turned the road to Beth Horon, and another company turned to the road of the border that overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears. So they had gone in and killed all the blacksmiths. But all the Israelites would go down to the Philistines to sharpen each man's plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. And the charge for a sharpening was a pim for the plowshares. Don't even know how much that was. The mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to set the points of the goads. So it came about on the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear to be found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and Jonathan, his son. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. Now, this is getting ready to be a story, okay? This is getting ready to be an amazing story. Basically, what's happened is they made sure the people are disarmed. Whoo-wee. I could just pause right there and preach on that, right? They've made sure that their enemies are disarmed, okay? Otherwise, if they had the kind of weaponry they needed, they could not easily come against them. But instead, they've made certain that all that the Israelites have are farm implements. Making sure that all that the people have are hunting weapons, right? Make sure that there's no way in which they can mount an effective resistance. But God still has an answer, okay? God still has an answer to that. Now, it happened one day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that's on the other side." But he did not tell his father. And Saul was sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men. Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother and son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest, in Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. But the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side and a sharp rock on the other. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other, Sina. I guess they named their rocks. In the front of one, it was a rock concert. The front of one faced northward, opposite Michmash, the other southward, opposite Gibeah. And Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." So you're starting to get the picture here, right? They are up against a massive army that is well-equipped, well-armed. They're coming out with farm implements to engage in this fight, but God has a plan, and he puts that plan in the heart of this young man who goes, just he and his armor bearer. Man, talk about your special forces. So his armor bearer said to him, "Do what is in your heart to do. Go then, here I am with you according to your heart." Wow, that's a loyal guy, right? Then Jonathan said, "Very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them. And if they say thus to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and not go up to them. But if they say thus, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this will be a sign to us." Wow. So again, what's happening here? The word of the Lord. Jonathan has received a word from God, right? And this is the test sign that he's going to put out there, right? If they say this, if they say, "Come on, we got you," then we'll know that the Lord has given us favor. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, the Hebrews are coming out of their holes where they've hidden." They're mocking them. Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us and we will show you something." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel this day." And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees with his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. As he came after him, his armor bearer killed them. The first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half an acre of land. Then there was trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and the raiders also trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it was a very great trembling. So not only did they quake in fear, but God shook the ground. Okay? Right? Now the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and there was the multitude melting away. So they were running here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, "Now call the roll and see who has gone from us." And when they had called the roll, surprisingly, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Abijah, "Bring the ark of God here." For at that time the ark of the Lord was with the children of Israel. Now it happened while Saul talked to the priest that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all the people who were with him assembled, and they went to the battle. And indeed, every man's sword was against his neighbor, and there was very great confusion. Moreover, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines before that time, who went up with them into the camp from the surrounding country, they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Okay? So what is that telling you? Well, Saul sees what's happening and presses the advantage and basically says, let's get in on that action. Charge! And as he does so, it tells us that there were people, presumably along this bordering area where Israel's territory bordered with the Philistines. There were people of Israel who had kind of made, I don't know, kind of an alliance, I guess, with the Philistines, right? So that they were in with the Philistines. They were among them, meaning that, they were next door neighbors, so they had to make some kind of grudging peace with them. But suddenly, those guys turn and join Saul and Jonathan in the battle. Likewise, all the men of Israel who were hidden in the mountains of Ephraim, when they heard the Philistines were fleeing, they followed hard after them. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle shifted to Beth Aven. Okay? So this is an amazing victory that God gives to them, even though Samuel, displeased with Saul, has told him, your kingship is now numbered. Okay? Now, I want you to stop and think for just a minute what kind of guy Jonathan was in this whole story. Not only was he incredibly valiant, but more important than being valiant was he was obedient to God. His obedience to the word of the Lord. Because he knew what God said. He went up to challenge them, and he knew that if they answered back in such and such a way, that was a sign from God. This will be a sign to you, God had told him. If they answer you back, come on up here, we got something to give to you, then you go on up there because I'm going to be with you and you're going to smack them down, right? But think about this. This is pretty amazing to me because Jonathan now knows that he's been passed over. Because Samuel's already announced it. The kingship shall not go to your children. Your kingship will not last past this generation, right? He knows that he's been passed over, but he also knows that the ways of Yahweh are right, okay? He also knows that the ways of God are correct. So he's obedient to the Lord in the midst of all of this. And you'll see that character revealed in him as this story goes on. It says, and the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I've taken vengeance on my enemies. So none of the people tasted food. Now all the people of the land came to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people had come into the woods, there was the honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared this oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. Therefore he stretched out the end of the rod that was in his hand and dipped it in a honeycomb and put the hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. Then one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats food this day, and the people were faint. But Jonathan said, listen to this quote, my father has troubled the land. That wasn't right, in other words. Look now how my countenance is brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found. For now there would not have been a much greater would there not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines. Now they had driven back the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, so the people were very faint, and the people rushed on the spoil and took sheep, oxen, and calves, slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood, still in the meat. Okay, not cool as far as Israelites are concerned, right? Then they told Saul, saying, look, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating the blood. So he said, you have dealt treacherously. Roll a large stone to me this day. Then Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, bring me here every man's ox and every man's sheep. Slaughter them here and eat. Do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night and slaughtered it there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. This was the first altar that he built unto the Lord. Okay? So, by golly, if anyone eats a bite today before we have conquered all of our enemies, I will strike them dead, right? Let them be cursed. Whoopsie. My son, who led the way in the battle, didn't get the memo, right? And so he ate a little something. And when he's questioned about it, he says, well, if that's what my dad said, my dad was dead wrong. Okay? Come the end of the day, the people are so hungry, so starving, because think about this, they've been fighting for days, not eating properly. So now they're completely exhausted, out of energy, about to fall over on the ground. And then all of a sudden, they just go kind of half crazy and start eating practically raw meat. without properly preparing it, right? And they sin against God by doing so because God has told them don't eat meat with the blood strangled in it, right? So they're out there gobbling down the raw, the rare steak. And Saul puts a stop to it and says, bring me, your animals, sits up a great stone, bring me your animals, and they have a big barbecue so that the people can eat their fill, so that they can be refreshed. Now, which one was hearing from the Lord that day? Jonathan. Certainly not Saul. Saul was acting according to the counsel of his own mind, acting according to what seemed best to him, acting according to his own, how shall I say this, his own spur of the moment, kind of whatever his anger or zeal was in the moment, rather than listening to the wisdom of God. And there's not even any indication here that he consults with God. And this is something that will come up later, okay? This is something that Samuel will confront him about, right? The fact that he doesn't consult with God. He doesn't talk with God. He doesn't seek God's counsel. Instead, he acts, what did the passage say earlier? He acts rashly, okay? Which means he acts, just on impulse. Rather than stopping, stilling his heart, and saying, Lord, what would you have us to do? He acts rashly. And therefore, because of his rash behavior, he runs past his skis. Many, many times he gets out over his skis, as they say, right? And so he's moved out beyond the Lord. In many cases, he moves out from under the Lord's protection. This is so vital. This is such a vital lesson. And yet, what's interesting about this is precisely what Samuel prophesied. Here's the problem. If you have a king and he's not a man of sound character, that's going to be a problem, okay? And here you have a Saul who is headstrong and rash and does what he thinks is right rather than consulting with the Lord. A man after God's own heart does what? He wants to know what God thinks. His first concern is to find out what God says. So the very first act of a man who has a heart after God is to do what? Consult with the prophets. Find out what the men of God are saying. Find out what the word of the Lord is. Consult with the higher power before you start acting. But Saul is just all over the map here, right? Just doing whatever seems to be right in his own eyes and oftentimes striking out in doing so. Now Saul says, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. That's problematic. Then the priest said, let us draw near to God here. So Saul asked the counsel of God, right? So who is the voice of wisdom here? The priests. Wait a minute. Don't you think you should ask God first before you go running off down here in the middle of the night to attack them? So Saul asked counsel of God. Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. Okay? Now, many people pray. All of us pray, presumably. Every Christian prays, has a prayer life. But how many of us understand that when prayer is not answered, that sometimes the answer to that is wait, right? It's not necessarily a yes. It's not necessarily a no. It's a wait. If we don't hear from the Lord, if we don't get God's counsel, then what is God saying? God did not answer. Does that mean God's not going to answer? No. It just simply means that God chose to wait in delivering his answer to Saul. And as we've seen, Saul is not the most patient of men. And Saul said, come over here, all you chiefs of the people, and know and see what this sin was today. For as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. Okay? So now he's thinking, what? Well, God's not answering, so there must be some sin. Right? So what's the sin? Obviously, Jonathan disobeying my command, my rash command, not to eat. Can't be me. I can't be the problem. I don't need to be searching my own heart for what the issue is here. Instead, it's surely because Jonathan disobeyed me. But not a man among all the people answered him. That's an answer too, isn't it? Right? When he stands up and makes this declaration, I'll even put my own son to death, and they all kind of just stand there looking at him. Like, are you really that dumb? And he said to all Israel, you be on one side, and my son Jonathan and I will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, give a perfect lot. So Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, cast lots between my son Jonathan and me. So Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him and said, I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand. So now I must die? Saul answered, God, do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. But the people said to Saul, okay? So, isn't this crazy? Okay? So, first of all, he cast lots, right? What's the purpose of casting lots? We eliminate certain people's voice from the equation, right? Okay, we cast lots, it goes to the people's side, so you guys go over there and shut up. Now we cast lots, it goes to Jonathan's side, you have to stand still and be quiet. So now I'm the one who's going to make the decision, and the decision is you got to die. But the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Whew. Then Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went back to their own place. Now, what an amazing story, right? But the one thing that we can see clearly in this story, the one thing that emerges from this picture clearly is how unstable Saul is. And why is he unstable? He doesn't listen to God. He doesn't inquire of God. God never commanded, don't eat this day. Saul commanded it. And again, this goes back precisely to what Samuel warned them. The king shall do according to his own pleasure. Okay? If you will listen to the Lord, all will be well, but if the king is going to do what he wants to do, then the people will suffer. Okay? So what we see here is an indication of this man swinging wildly back and forth from one side to another. I'm for open borders. No, I'm not really for open borders. What can I say, right? We have the same kind of wishy-washiness, do we not? Among all of our leadership on both sides, you know? Which side are they on? Well, let's see. Which way is the wind blowing today? Which way are the winds of political fortune blowing, rather than taking a stand on principle and sticking with it regardless, right? So what we see here is just unstable leadership on display. And exactly what God warned them about. Exactly what God warned them about. You want a king? Then I'm going to give you a king, but you are not going to enjoy the ways of a king. Let's pray. Father, I just ask that you would now place your seal upon your word. God, help us to retain what we learned, Lord. But more than retain, help us to learn how it applies in life, not only as individuals, but in our life corporately, as a people of God, as a church, before the eyes of the watching world, but also help us learn how it applies corporately to us as a nation and in our interaction with the nations of the world, God. Your principles, your truth, your laws stand above the laws of men. Father, may we take to heart what it is that God commands. In Jesus' name.